So we find ourselves in this very strange moment. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You and I are in two different places. We're unable to have this conversation face to face in person. And I'm wondering, and I've had a number of people comment to me who have worked on, especially on the niqab issue, that they think that maybe the pandemic and now the requirement to mask in many instances is perhaps having or could have an impact on this issue, its social construction, and the the perception of face covering. I'm just wondering if you have been thinking about this as well as we live in this very strange time.
I have. It's hard not to. Pandemic, but I think it's fair to say that most Canadians had probably not met or had a conversation with a niqab-wearing woman. So the niqab for many people was foreign, unknown, even uncomfortable for those who were just not used to it. And of course, stereotypes about Muslims, anti-Muslim racism, also constructed the niqab as a symbol of extremism, terrorism, and as I've mentioned already, oppression towards women. And politicians in Canada and abroad, I would say, exacerbated this otherness of women who wear the niqab in several inflammatory debates. It's really kind of insisting on the impossibility of functioning in society with one's face covered, right? But with the COVID-19 health pandemic, I think there's been a real shift in how we view faces being covered. So now it's seen as something one does out of a sense of courtesy, care for others, even compassion for others. You know, it's become very normal to have conversations, to shop in grocery stores, to receive public services, and just see people everywhere with their faces covered. So I think the pandemic has revealed rather poignantly how the justifications for legal prohibitions of the niqab, which of course have included things like the need to be identified, the need to communicate, to have security, among others, are really so disingenuous. Society is not falling apart because we are unable to see parts of people's faces. And because of this, I think the pandemic may also change some people's ideas about niqab-wearing women. So Muslim women who cover their faces, we know that they aroused visceral reactions in people. And those reactions were typically negative, based, I would say, primarily on presumptions and stereotypes. But I have certainly heard from niqab-wearing women that they are feeling more acceptance from people on the streets who might be more willing to understand and get to know how others might live their lives. So, you know, rather than being alarmed by difference or really certain that our practices are more superior, because of the situation that we find ourselves in, I think there is a possibility that people are better able to put themselves in the shoes of other people. Now, I'm not going to suggest this is a universal experience. Of course, it's not. We know that many politicians who are in favor of niqab bans remain very entrenched in their positions, and they don't see the hypocrisy of fining people for not wearing a face mask and then also fining women who wear niqabs, which of course is exactly what is happening in France. So yes, I would say our perception of the niqab is shifting as our context changes. And that makes sense. I mean, the niqab, I think, has always been a shifting signifier. It means it really depends on who dons it and in what context it's worn.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, those are really interesting thoughts around this situation that we're all in. And it will be interesting to see how things do shift over the course of time as we move through, hopefully move through and out of the pandemic state. In your book, you present a compelling argument about the illogic of bans and regulations of the niqab. And it is truly a compelling in public spaces, pardon me, the ban of the niqab in public spaces. And it is truly a compelling argument, carefully laid out, and very, very rational and logical in your approach to demonstrate the illogic and irrationality of this approach. But I can't help but think that oftentimes objections to the niqab are based not on logic, not on evidence, but on emotion. And I'm wondering, how do we deal with this? How do we combat or confront objections based on emotion?
That is such a great question. You're so right that those who are in favor of banning the niqab are often relying on emotion rather than logic or evidence in their appeals. And usually there are the emotions of dislike, fear, discomfort. So I believe, as in most forms of seeking change, there are multiple avenues. So I think, first of all, of course, we need to point out the failures in logic, the absence of evidence, and we have to use the legal tools that are available to us to combat discrimination and misogyny, racism, and oppression generally, and any sort of emancipatory aspirations, as I've mentioned, really have to consider the intersectional perspectives of the very people involved. And in this case, that's religious women. But this is maybe less an appeal to emotion than a demand for justice. And I certainly think that's appropriate, given that there are clear violations of rights, I would say, at stake here. And that demand for justice, I think, can change people's minds. But having said that, I'd like to kind of point to some more of the kind of micro ways in which to overcome the emotions of dislike, fear, or discomfort. And that is by relying on another set of emotions, if you like, those of empathy, compassion, and caring. So there are a number of creative ways in which this might come up. And in my final chapter of the book, I write about the incredibly resilient stories of resistance by niqab-wearing women and their allies, despite the many legal obstacles, attitudinal barriers that they encounter. And hearing about their stories, understanding who these women are in all of their complexity, I think can be a really effective response to these emotions of dislike, fear, and discomfort. So niqab-wearing women around the world have been incredibly vocal in seeking to educate and dispel myths about who they are. And amazingly, despite much negativity directed toward them, they have been surprisingly optimistic in their conviction to live the good life and share their stories with complete strangers, whether through formal presentations at universities, writing opinion pieces, or just the small, simple act of striking up a conversation with someone on the bus or in a park. So they've really chosen to use people's curiosity and fear about them as a way to begin a conversation. And I think that they've really recognized the power in sharing spaces and experiences and how this can really shift the emphasis from difference to similarity. And of course, there's other ways. Artists have an incredibly big role to play in shifting people's ideas. And I refer to in my final chapter the work of one artist in particular, a British artist named Hannah Habibi, who has painted niqab-wearing women in bold, bright, humorous ways that really question expectations about Muslim women's dress, about their gender roles, and even about religious norms. So her portraits of women in face veils convey a feeling of playfulness and fun that is in sharp contrast to the monochromatic, homogenous, dehumanized images of niqab-wearing women that we typically see in the media. Of course, the media can also play a significant, have a significant impact in how we view marginalized groups. Mainstream media will often cover stories about niqab-wearing women, especially when there are these large controversies, but it's not often that they seek out their niqab-wearing women's perspectives. That, fortunately, is beginning to change in the Canadian media. The CBC, for example, has really been making an effort to find and feature the complex and moving stories of niqab-wearing women that just reveal their humanity. And of course, then there's the work, and it's important work, of the allies of niqab-wearing women. So simple, ordinary deeds can really be transformative in their ability to shore up niqab-wearing women during difficult times. So a small act of kindness, such as a smile, a salam, or standing with a woman against bigotry, really makes an impression and can alter a woman's sense of belonging in the community. So I think these small acts can really shift these sometimes really entrenched emotions of dislike and discomfort. I would hope that love and kindness might be an aspiration that really enhances our public life and transforms our relations with even those that we think of initially as strangers, that it's something that we might strive for. And I think that niqab-wearing women and their allies have really provided us with numerous examples that are so uplifting and heartening.
Thank you, Natasha. One of the things I really like about your work, and this work in particular, is your ability to hang on to a more formal notion of justice and what law can do in a positive way, but also your recognition and acknowledgement and detailing of the ways in which micro gestures, everyday life, and people in everyday life can make such a huge difference as well. In other words, it's not one or the other, it's both. And you illustrate that beautifully in this new book of yours, In Your Face. And thank you again so much for your willingness to think about the questions that I had about your book, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Lori.